Welcome to Finding Medina, Episode 10, The Battle of Medina Revisited. I'm Brandon Seal. On August 4th, 1813, José Álvarez de Toledo took over command of the Republican Army of the North. That same day, news reached him that not one, but two Spanish Royalist armies were converging on San Antonio. The first army consisted of the remnants of Colonel Elizondos' force, which the Republicans had convincingly whipped at the Battle of Alazan Creek back in June. The second army, however, was the formidable and unbeaten Veracruz regiment under Joaquín de Arredondo, the newly appointed comandante for all of the northeastern provinces of New Spain. In what amounted to a coup d'etat, Toledo had in effect deposed the also unbeaten Bernardo Gutiérrez de Lara to win his appointment as commander-in-chief, a move that had severely strained relations in the Republican Army. Many of the soldiers openly suspected Toledo, himself a Spaniard, though born in Cuba, of being a Royalist plant, determined to hand over the Republican Army to the Royalists at the first opportunity. The loudest amongst these voices was that of Colonel Miguel Menchaca, commander of the mounted Tejano contingent of the Republican Army, which made up 800 or 900 of Toledo's 1,400-man force. With Gutiérrez de Lara gone, Menchaca remained as the most tenured, visible, and feared Republican leader. The Royalist commander, Joaquín de Arredondo, went so far as to place a 1,000 peso bounty on Menchaca's head in a laughable attempt to entice someone to betray him. Perhaps Arredondo didn't appreciate, however, what the name Menchaca meant to Tejanos, who had relied on Menchacas for nearly a century for their protection, or to the 100 or so Native Americans in the Republican ranks, who had been dealing or fighting with Menchacas since the 1690s. Needless to say, the bounty bought Arredondo nothing. Toledo, by contrast, remained an unknown to most of the men in the Republican Army. Many probably echoed the sentiments of one Señora Rodriguez, quote, "Were Menchaca in command, we would be safe. But who is this Gachupin? Has he ever won a battle?" End quote. As we noted in the previous episode, there was no love lost between Menchaca and Toledo. From the start, Menchaca doubted Toledo's motives, confiding to a friend that he believed him to be plotting some form of treachery. To quell the discontent in his ranks, Toledo convened a formal council of war on August 9th. Menchaca, accustomed to the hit-and-run tactics of warfare on the Texas plains, advocated riding out and harassing the Royalists on their march. Toledo dismissed the horse-obsessed Tejano suggestions as thin cover for a horse-raiding expedition. Yet there was more to Menchaca's eagerness to ride out against the enemy than Toledo gave him credit for. The Republican Army of the North had already defeated 3 Royalist armies in the field, without Toledo's help, Menchaca might have added, by taking the fight to the enemy, not by waiting. More to the point, Menchaca, a San Antonian himself, wasn't going to just sit by and let the Royalists assault his town. The Council of War quickly dissolved into name-calling, and no decision was made. On the next day, the 10th of August, Menchaca met with Toledo once again and put the issue more bluntly. He commanded the loyalty of 2/3 of the Republican Army, which at the end of the day was going to follow him. And by this point, even some of the American officers who had been sympathetic to Toledo began to question his leadership as well. Toledo ultimately realized that he had little choice but to go along, particularly as Arredondo grew nearer each day. Finally, on August 15th, 1813, after 10 days of fits and starts and political infighting, the Republican Army of the North marched out of San Antonio, down the old Laredo Road. On August 17th, they reached the Medina River and made camp. Arredondo and the Royalists, their scouts reported, were by then only a few miles away. Despite all the infighting in the preceding weeks, when the Republicans marched out for battle that next morning, quote, "Never was an army more sure of victory," end quote. The Republicans had decided to ambush the Royalists. A company of sharpshooters under a Captain Joseph Taylor would trigger the ambush, supported at a short distance by the Republicans' artillery. Menchaca's mounted Tejanos, the bulk of the force, would be held back in 3 massed columns to guard the various crossings of the Medina River, preventing any sort of Royalist in-run into San Antonio and poised to charge at the first sounds of battle. 2 regiments of American infantry, named the Washington and Madison regiments, were supposed to frontally assault the Royalists and pin them down, while the sharpshooters under Captain Taylor tried to flank the Royalists once the battle had commenced. Accordingly, before dawn on the morning of August the 18th, Captain Taylor and his company of sharpshooters marched down the Laredo Road to a forward position in a brush line a few miles south of the Medina River, just north of the thick Encinal de Medina. With hills on either flank and an open plain separating them from the Encinal, all of the commentators of the battle agreed that the Republicans had chosen an ideal spot to ambush the approaching Royalists. And by all of the commentators of the battle, I'm including Arredondo. The Royalist general, it seems, had been made aware of the funneling effect of a little canyon carved by the Laredo Road at this point. So on the morning of the battle, August 18th, 1813, he ordered his army off the main Laredo Road to march cross-country toward a different crossing of the Medina River. He sent ahead Colonel Elizondo with 180 cavalrymen to screen his movements and see if they might be able to draw out the Republicans a little, or at least determine their strength. By 8 o'clock that morning, Elizondo's men had penetrated nearly all the way through the thick Encinal. They apparently decided to spread out to look for signs of the Republicans, whom they suspected of being nearby. One of Elizondo's outriders, entirely separated from the rest of the force, rode out through the northern edge of the Encinal and onto a little plain. From this point, his horse probably would have been able to smell the Medina River just a few miles ahead. He trotted forward, distractedly, noting nothing special about the terrain around him. Only 60 or 70 yards in front of him, however, a company of Republican sharpshooters crouched with trembling trigger fingers. Their enemy had at last appeared. Sort of. They were laying in wait for the big kill, not some oblivious Royalist cavalryman. Had he seen them? Was he just playing dumb so they wouldn't fire on him, and so he could then ride back and report their position to the rest of the Royalists? His presence meant that his comrades were probably nearby, of course, which meant that even a single rifle shot could give away the Republicans' position to the larger Royalist force that they still had a chance at surprising. Nerves won out over prudence, however. 6 or 8 shots rang out. Nerves also apparently guided the sharpshooter's aim. They all missed. The Royalist cavalryman wheeled his horse around and fled. The men in the Republican ranks knew that their cover was blown, and now their adrenaline was pumping. Their aggressiveness had always been rewarded in battle, and they saw no reason to abandon it now. The Washington and Madison regiments emerged from their hiding spots and started rushing after the retreating Royalist cavalrymen. Menchaca's mounted Tejanos, some distance away, responded to the first shots just as quickly and came storming forward now. The American infantry, Tejano cavalry, and Native American allies caught up with each other on the very northern edge of the Encinal, where in addition to a forest of old oak trees, they also collided with Colonel Elizondo's 180-man force. It's a miracle that the Republicans didn't just overrun Elizondo right then and there. Perhaps the fact that they were expecting a larger Royalist force restrained them. Either way, it was clear that Elizondo couldn't hold out for long. Fortunately, Arredondo had foreseen this and preemptively ordered Elizondo to retreat at first contact and draw the Republicans back toward the rest of his Royalist force. This time, and unlike before the Battle of Alazan Creek, Elizondo listened to his commander. Of course, 800 to 900 sets of Republican hoofbeats and several hundred rifle rounds whizzing by him each minute probably helped Elizondo make the right decision as well. Arredondo soon received a messenger from Elizondo alerting him to the presence of the Republican enemy. From the sounds of battle ahead, Arredondo could probably tell that Elizondo was badly outnumbered. To support Elizondo in his retreat, Arredondo sent forward 2 cañoncitos and 150 more cavalry under that most royalist of all San Antonians, the quote, Reverend Lieutenant Colonel Don Juan Manuel Zambrano, end quote. When they saw Zambrano's force joining up with Elizondo's, some Republicans thought that they now had the entire Royalist army in front of them. This has to be taken as a testament to how well Elizondo and Zambrano and their men fought. That their 330-man troop fooled at least some of the Republicans into thinking that they were facing a force that they knew to be several thousand strong. The illusion wasn't nearly enough to actually stem the Republican tide, of course. The Republicans soon captured Zambrano's little cannons. Then they began to encircle the entire Royalist troop. They tasted victory. The Royalists felt the noose tightening and began to pull back. But the Republicans didn't let up. They pursued more hotly now, deeper into the Encinal, horsemen moving forward, outstripping the riflemen, backtracking, realizing that their artillery was bogged down, stopping. The Gachupines were getting away, realizing that they themselves were now several miles from water, sweating, kicking up sand so fine that it filled the air around them like dust, obscuring further their visibility in the brushy Encinal, but charging forward with every step still. The Republican commander-in-chief, Toledo, rightly feared that he was losing control of the battle, and he must have sensed that he wasn't yet facing the entire Royalist force. Like Arredondo, he had been trained at a Spanish military academy, albeit the Naval Academy, which of course begs the question as to how well qualified a naval ensign was to command a land army. Still, it should have given him some sense of what sort of tactics to expect from Arredondo. Of course, it might also have been what kept holding him back. To try to regain control of his force, Toledo ordered a general retreat, at which point Menchaca and the American commander, quote, galloped violently up and down the lines, countermanding the order, end quote. As logical as a pullback seemed to Toledo then, and to his apologists later, by this point in the battle, it probably would have been pointless. Arredondo had to jump on them, and may have considered refusing to give battle in favor of just racing into San Antonio around the Republicans. Remember, the Republicans had set their ambush on the wrong road that morning, and they still didn't know where Arredondo's main force was. Where exactly, then, was Toledo proposing to pull back to? Yet the more significant factor may have been that the Republican army didn't have retreat in their playbook. They had won at Goliad by attacking their besiegers. They had prevailed at Rosillo when they turned the tables on their would-be ambushers. And they had triumphed at Alazan Creek against an enemy in a commanding position through sheer tenacity. The sources all agree on Menchaca's position now. Tejanos don't retreat. Los Tejanos no se retiran. Menchaca resolved that, and here it's slightly abridged, quote, under no consideration would he quit until he and his men had either died or conquered. If the other Republican commanders were men, they would act like men and follow him now, end quote. And so, lured along by Colonel Elizondo, mile after sandy mile, the Republicans continued in hot pursuit, their artillery and horses atascándose under the merciless August sun, the men so thirsty that they began to drink the filthy water used to clean the cannon bores. Half a mile passed, or maybe 2, or maybe 4. It was hard to keep track. Somehow, some of the men got the impression that a stream lay just ahead. By this point, thirst was even more motivating than bloodlust, and they pushed wildly now through a particularly dense line of oak trees and into an opening. Perhaps as the sounds of the Republican pursuit grew near, Arredondo decided to halt his march and ordered his men to take up a defensive position. They threw up wagons, logs, and pieces of luggage to create a, quote, temporary breastworks, end quote. They drew themselves up into a U shape with their infantry in the center and their 9 remaining cannons on the flanks. Through the oaks of the Encinal, the first of Elizondo and Zambrano's cavalrymen now came into view. They rode full gallop for the safety of Arredondo's lines, and close behind them came the Republican Army of the North. As the Encinal parted for the Republicans, however, it framed a horrible sight. Just across the stream that could have slaked their thirst, quote, "We found the enemy well hosted as they received us warmly as in their power," end quote. The first Royalist volley tore through the surprised Republicans' ranks. Here, the heavy oaks of the Encinal came to the Republicans' momentary rescue, shielding them in small measure and providing them cover to reform their lines. Once they had regrouped, to Arredondo's horror, the Republican infantry began to advance again, quote, "strongly, with tenacious resolve," end quote. Soon, Republicans' rifled arms began to pick off Royalist artillerymen, to good effect, though the Royalist fire never let up. Republicans in the rear strained to pull their artillery into range. Royalist officers yelled at their men and kept them in the ranks even as their comrades began to fall. The mounted Tejanos and their Native American allies hadn't missed a beat either. Upon discovering the Royalists, they had immediately, almost instinctively, sought the Royalists' flanks and rear. Even through the thickly wooded Encinal, the Tejano and Native American horsemen were easy to follow as they charged forward in their flamboyant attire. No two men dressed alike, no two men colored alike even. A few managed to get around Arredondo's lines and into his rear. There, they saw the general mounted on a rise observing the battle. They had him. Some dismounted and took aim. Others charged at a gallop. At the last second, a pair of alert Royalist escorts realized what was happening. In a flurry of panic, they shuffled Arredondo to cover and parried the Republican attack. Arredondo then called up more of his cavalry, repositioned his forces to better protect his rear and baggage train, and fought off the Tejanos, who were forced to pull back and regroup. For maybe 3 or 4 hours, the armies traded fire, the Republicans' all-green banner lashing out at the image of Nuestra Señora del Carmen under which the Royalists fought, as little as 40 yards separating the poor infantrymen, while the mounted majority attempted to maneuver around each other. The Royalists, we know, fired 950 cannon rounds in total, and thousands of smaller arms. The Republicans, presumably, matched them rifle shot for rifle shot. In the end, it was a scene out of Dante. Quote, "The loose soil had been reduced to an impalpable powder. The clouds of dust and the smoke of burned powder formed a dense mantle made lurid by the glare of flaming guns," end quote, one Republican later recalled. Yet the Republicans, slowly, began to feel their advantage. They noted dead Royalist artillerymen piling up around their guns. And so Menchaca, the Tejanos, and their Native American allies mounted up again and rode out around the Royalist flanks. And the Republican riflemen pushed forward against their fate one last time. The moment of truth was upon our research team. Our year-long effort to identify and follow the Republicans' trail to the Battle of Medina had led us here, to Cathys Brown's house near the Bear-Atascosa County line, the epicenter of the handful of artifacts that we had turned up during our search of the area. I use the term epicenter loosely, however. We could still pretty well count on 2 hands everything we had found that might be a Battle of Medina artifact. Before we went any further, we decided, we needed to try to validate what we had found. I felt a little bad overwhelming Cathys with our 7-man crew that day that we went down to her house, but she was actually all for it. She had recently expressed to me something that many I've encountered on this journey seem to be feeling. Historically, the search for this battlefield has been shrouded in secrecy, with many researchers keeping their work to themselves lest someone else jump their claim and find the battle site before they do. This, in turn, has left many local residents and artifact holders, like Cathys, uneasy with projects like ours. Researchers seemed to come and go, disappearing as quickly and mysteriously as they had appeared, raising suspicion as to their motives, which makes people even less inclined to share what artifacts or stories they may have. But what's changed, according to Cathys, and she's not the only one I've heard this from, is that it feels like now it's time to just figure this battle out. You can't study the Battle of Medina and its aftermath without being overwhelmed by the conviction that more people need to know about this stuff. And if finding definitive archaeological proof of the battlefield's location is what it's going to take to bring more attention to these events, then we need to work together to find it. And so Cathys was willing to allow us to invade her privacy and examine her old canicas, the 1.5-inch iron balls that she and her siblings had found in the creek on their grandparents' property. San Antonio City archaeologist Kay Hines accompanied us that day and invited along Sergio and Melinda Iruegas. Sergio and Melinda's firm, GTI Environmental, performs environmental assessments and impact statements for projects that require them, many of which have a historical bent. In particular, they own and are experts in the use of an X-ray fluorescence analyzer. An X-ray fluorescence analyzer, or an XRF for short, looks like a policeman's handheld radar. You hold it about 3 inches away from the object you want to analyze, pull the trigger, and you let it work its magic. It's non-invasive, non-damaging, and astonishing, really, for the level of detail that it can give you about the exact metallurgic composition of the object in question. Of course, our goal was to stump the XRF analyzer. We wanted Cathys' little iron balls to read out no match, indicating that they were made of some kind of pre-modern field-cast alloy that defied recognizable modern classifications. While Sergio and Melinda warmed up their XRF analyzer, we laid out 5 objects that we wanted to test that day. The first 2 were modern mild steel and cast iron balls that I had brought along as controls. The next was a 3-inch ball that someone had supposedly found several miles north of Cathys' house and turned into Kay Hines years ago. It sure looked like a cannonball, and its proximity to Cathys' artifacts gave it new relevance, so we decided to test it. The last 2 artifacts were Cathys' canicas, the balls that she and her siblings had found in Las Gallinas Creek as children. So first, we tested the XRF analyzer on the modern mild steel and cast iron control balls. LAC, the XRF screen read for the first ball, and nothing more, indicating that it was your basic, modern, low-carbon mild steel. Then the second ball, LAC, and additionally, 2.3% pure Fe, the XRF read out, correctly detecting the 2% iron content that sets cast iron apart from plain mild steel. The machine seemed to be dialed in. Next, we turned the XRF gun on Kay's 3-inch ball. The scan took a little longer than the other ones, making us think at first that the machine wasn't working. Then, we began to hope that the XRF analyzer was simply struggling to identify this artifact's composition. At last, the scan ended. LA3115 and LA86L20, it read out. What in the world did that mean? As I excitedly Googled the code, Sergio tamped down my expectations. That the XRF analyzer had found a match at all indicated that those were decidedly modern steel alloys. My Google search quickly confirmed that he was right. That result surprised me, though, and I'll confess, it kind of threw me for a loop. Since the moment that Cathys had revealed her iron balls to us, I'd been researching, trying to figure out what other things perfectly spherical iron balls could be used for, and I hadn't come up with much. They aren't usually used for ball bearings, which are generally stainless or chrome to prevent fouling from rust. And solid balls aren't typically used for decorative purposes either. It's much cheaper to use hollowed-out balls. A railroad track ran parallel to Las Gallinas Creek, But consultations with friends in the rail business found no obvious uses for solid 1.5-inch steel balls in rail operations either. What else could a several-inch diameter iron or steel ball be, though? We turned at last to Cathys canicas. We picked up first the slightly smaller of her two balls. Measuring about 1.5 inches across and weighing 7.9 ounces, it didn't look 200 years old. It was smooth, with no signs of pitting, and didn't have the kind of seam around the circumference you would expect from something that had been cast. But maybe I was just being jaded from the results of the previous scan. We ran the XRF Analyzer across Cathys' smooth ball, and after a few minutes, we had our result. It read out, LAC, 2.6% pure Fe. It was cast iron. Now, cast iron itself was around in the 1800s, and occasionally could have and probably was used in munitions, so this didn't rule it out entirely. But the XRF Analyzer was pretty sure that the steel in this ball was modern, pretty well ruling out a Battle of Medina connection. Of course, the presence of an old, solid cast iron sphere in the middle of the encinal made no more sense to me than a 3-inch mild steel ball did, but we had to trust our instruments. All of our hopes now rested on Cathys' last ball. Rusted, pitted, and weighing in at 9.6 ounces, it looked more promising. Sort of like what you would expect a 200-year-old cannonball should look like. The XRF Analyzer would tell us for sure, though. So we pulled the trigger and waited. I rotated the artifact slowly in my hand, massaging it like the least effective stress ball you've ever felt in your life. My expectations were low, but my nerves were high. The reading finally popped up. No match. No match. No match was the best that we could have hoped for. We knew starting out that the XRF Analyzer wasn't going to confirm whether any of our artifacts had definitively come from the Battle of Medina. But no match at least kept alive the possibility that the little ball sitting on Cathys' table was pre-modern, like maybe 100 years old or older or something. And there really wasn't any industrial activity going on in the Encinal de Medina 100 years ago, I convinced myself. So that meant it had to be even older. And that meant that it had to be a munition from the battle. And Cathys assured me that her ball was just one of many that her and her siblings had found over the years. And just like the balls that their neighbors and friends in the area were finding all the time. Plotted on a map against the other handful of artifacts that other searchers of the battle had found, Cathys' balls did seem to be relatively centrally located, even if there was several hundred acres of sand mines between her and the other artifacts. Still, it all made for a pretty compelling case to really drill down our search on the Las Gallinas Creek watershed area that drained into the creek bed that crossed her grandparents' property. And it made for a pretty compelling, if not convincing case as well, that the Battle of Medina, dare I say it, might have happened somewhere nearby here. And yet, as I pulled out of Cathys' driveway that afternoon, with a fresh batch of chocolate tamales in hand, I should say, I felt uneasy about something. Yes, we had found one potentially pre-modern artifact. But what in the world were those other modern steel and cast iron balls that we had found? The Indiana Jones in me tried to silence the questions and to simply savor the adrenaline that was still pumping in my veins. But that little fair-minded part of my brain couldn't help but asking, could there be some other reason that people living in the Encinal de Medina kept turning up these little balls? I pulled my truck off onto the side of the road next to one of the sand mines bordering Cathys' property so I could pull out my computer. As I waited for Google Earth to open on my machine, I watched across the fence line as buckets dropped piles of ore and aggregate on conveyor belts, moving the material across the mine and up into 100-foot-high silos, while other belts loaded finished product onto rail cars. Giant drums rotated solemnly beside them all. Once Google Earth was open, I zoomed in on the Encinal and started going back in time as far as the imagery would let me. It was clear that things don't change that quickly in the Encinal. For example, the sand mine next to me had been in operation for as long as Google had imagery. I then recalled an interview with a local who claimed that this mine in particular had been in operation for almost 100 years. Parked there next to the mine, a horrible idea occurred to me. I opened up my internet browser and typed in carbon steel balls mining operations. Within 0.64 seconds, I had 14,900,000 answers to the question I hadn't wanted to ask. When sand is mined out of the ground, I learned, it emerges in clumps, full of impurities, and in some cases, different-sized grains. To break down this material for sorting into consistent batches, the sand is dumped into giant drums, like a big old cement mixer, and rotated to crush and smooth the raw ore. These drums are called tumbling or grinding mills. And do you know what they put in these tumbling grinding mills? Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of carbon steel balls. Like the sand tumbling around in the mills in front of me. At that moment, I felt crushed. Every canica, every daimito, every iron ball that we or anyone else had found in this area over the last 100 years was now called into question. Even Cathys' rusted, pitted ball that had read out no match on the XRF Analyzer could have just been a 100-year-old ball used in earlier mining operations on the site next to her property. And then I realized that there was a double tragedy at play here. If at any time over the last 100 years, anyone working at those sand mines had found a legitimate iron cannonball, they would have been forgiven for thinking that it was just another grinding ball. Most likely, they would have picked it up, tossed it into the tumbling mill, and never thought twice about it. And as I zoomed out on the Google Earth image of the Encinal de Medina, I realized that the entire area was dotted with these mines. Absent a lot more information about early 1800s Spanish munitions, or finding an extreme concentration of pre-modern balls in one place, it could be almost impossible now to distinguish 200-year-old munitions from plain old 100-year-old grinding balls. The Encinal de Medina truly does have a way to swallow artifacts. And as the Republicans were finding out, it swallows armies as well. Just around the moment that Colonel Miguel Menchaca rode off with his mounted contingent in one last push to turn the Royalist flank, a gust of hot wind blew in from the southeast. The dust suspended in the air by thousands of pairs of trampling feet sandblasted the faces of the fatigued, sunburned men fighting in the melee. The wind cleared the dust and smoke from the battlefield, however, and Arredondo, situated on his perch above the fray, found his view of the battle markedly improved. The Republicans, he realized, were in a perilous position. Although their infantry was slowly, doggedly closing in on his lines, their casualties lay piled up all around them, and they were now separated from their cavalry. And he could read their weariness on their faces. They had been marching since before dawn that morning, through the August sun, without water, and across sand that swallowed everything it touched. There's a saying in Spanish that el diablo sabe más por viejo que por diablo. That the devil knows more because he's old than because he's the devil. And the devil Arredondo had learned more than a few tricks during a career waging war throughout the world. He called at this moment not for more troops, but for his buglers. He ordered them to sound out the notes of victory, a bugle call known in Spanish as the Diana. When his soldiers heard the call of victory, they found new energy and began to push forward. By contrast, When the Republicans heard the notes of victory ring out from Arredondo's bugles and saw the Royalists advancing on them, it confused them. In spite of all their losses to that point, the Republicans thought that they had been winning. They had disabled most of the Royalists' 9 cannons, and the Spaniards' shots now were few and far between. One Republican believed that, quote, 15 minutes more, end quote, would have given them victory, an opinion shared and echoed by many contemporary commentators of the battle. Of course, it may also simply have been that they didn't know what it felt like to lose. Then, right around that same time, they caught another stroke of bad luck. Somewhere around Arredondo's flank, a piece of canister shot found Colonel Miguel Menchaca's neck. Severely wounded, the gallant San Antonian, quote, every inch a patriot, wise, brave, and a born leader, end quote, tried to fight on, but he didn't get far. He fell, either there on the field or, according to his cousin, in Calaveras Creek, just a few miles northeast. A quick aside here. Though the evidence suggests that the body found on Blue Wing Road in 1968 with a piece of canister shot in its neck was too young to have been that of Colonel Menchaca, it's a little uncanny how well that body fits the traditional description of his death. Lieutenant Colonel José Francisco Ruiz didn't have time to contemplate these things, however. When he saw Menchaca go down, he took up his fallen banner and led the scattered Tejanos and Native Americans in 2 more charges. Again, Ruiz and the mounted contingent of the Republican Army made it to within pistol shot of Arredondo himself, but they just couldn't quite dislodge him. The Republicans' Native American allies also rushed in to aid their imperiled comrades in the infantry. Quote, they stood by the Americans to the last and shared their fate, end quote. The American officers rallied their men and encouraged them to reform their lines for one last concerted attack, as they had done so successfully at Rosillo and at Alazan Creek. The momentum of the battle had swung, however. Whereas before, when Republican soldiers looked around, they saw their companions beside them and the enemy in front. Now, it was all a jumble. Things began to fall apart. One by one, Republican soldiers began to fall back. Then, entire units. First confusion, and now panic swept through the Republican ranks. And in a flash, the Republican Army of the North, which until that moment had never known defeat, broke into full-blown retreat. The next several hours witnessed a rout, a running massacre back to the Medina River and beyond. 80 Republicans were taken prisoner in the field, only to be executed later that evening, perhaps along the banks of the Medina River, where Arredondo eventually made his camp. Most surrendering Republicans were just shot on the spot. Some were dismembered, their body parts impaled on pikes and tree branches. There's not much else to tell in this respect. The Republicans, Tejanos, Native Americans, and Anglo-Americans suffered more than 1,000 dead in the next few hours, compared to only 55 Royalists killed and a couple hundred wounded. We don't have precise numbers on this, but it seems that maybe only a few hundred Republicans escaped the slaughter. Some fled to the plains to go live with their Native American allies. Some, like José Francisco Ruiz and Antonio Delgado, fled to the east in the safety of the Sabine River. Yet Arredondo wouldn't let them go so easily. Without allowing him even a day's rest, Arredondo sent Elizondo in pursuit of the fleeing rebels, with orders to visit royal justice upon any that he might capture. In case you were worried, you'll be glad to know that the Republican commander-in-chief, General José Álvarez de Toledo, got away. When he realized that the battle was lost, he rode back to Louisiana as fast as his horse could carry him. From there, his prospects rapidly improved. Validating Menchaca's and others' suspicions, Within a few years, Toledo was an active informant for General Arredondo in New Orleans, passing him reports on the activities of Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara and others who continued laboring for independence. Toledo would ultimately return to Spain, where he provided testimony against his fellow former revolutionaries in exchange for immunity. He would die in his bed 40 years later as a trusted advisor of the Spanish king in a cushy appointment in Switzerland, the thousands of dead Texans that he left behind him, presumably long forgotten. Unfortunately for San Antonians, however, General Arredondo wasn't inclined to forget the past so easily. After taking a couple days to rest his men and bury his dead, he entered San Antonio, intent on teaching San Antonians a lesson that they would never forget. On the next episode of Finding Medina. Thank you for listening. I actually do have an exciting announcement here about a discovery that we did make leading up to this episode. The mysterious Joseph Baer, a longtime contributor to this podcast, has finally revealed to us his identity. His real name is Joseph Alvarez, no relation to José Alvarez de Toledo, I'm assured. After reading Schwartz and Tonoff's Forgotten Battlefield in one sitting many years ago, Joseph Alvarez has devoted nearly 20 years of his life to finding the battlefield, and neither time nor distance, that is, he's lived in Greece since 2003, has tempered his drive. As a native San Antonian from a long line of Bejareños, I think researching this topic is Joseph's way of staying connected to his roots, something I totally get. I bring all this up because Joseph's done as much detailed analysis of the Battle of Medina itself as anyone I've come across, and he has very generously allowed me to share it with you all on the Rivard Report webpage for this episode. Please go check out Joseph's documents that I've posted there. They'll help you visualize some of the things that I've tried to describe in this episode. Editing for this episode was performed by Susana Canseco, sound engineering by Stephen Bennett. A special thanks to my friend George Gaitan for letting us use his music on this series. You can find out more about him at georgegaitan.tripod.com. Thanks as always to my SWCA research buddies, Crystal Allgood, Rob Lakowitz, and Zachary Overfield, as well as to former San Antonio City archaeologist Kay Hines. Thanks to Brian Stauffer, our unofficial Old Spanish document transcriber, to Samantha Alanis, our cartographer-in-chief, to Cesar Gutierrez, our unofficial Archivo General de la Nación researcher, and to UTSA's Dean of Libraries, Dean Hendricks, our all-other document finder. And for more information about our podcast and other projects, check out www.brandonseal.com.